Welcome to Exploration Arcanum. My name is Jason. In today's episode, my guest is Dr. WhiteFeather Hunter. In this conversation, Dr. Hunter discusses her unique approach to blending feminist perspectives with biotechnology and witchcraft. She explores the implications of reproductive technologies, the significance of using menstrual fluid in scientific research, and the artistic practices involved in tissue engineering. Dr. Hunter also delves into her projects, including the sentient clitoris and the homuncularium. I want to thank Dr. Hunter for coming on the show. I'll put links to her work and social media in the description below. If you enjoy this episode, please give it a like and subscribe to the channel for more esoteric conversations. Thank you.
Casting circles beneath the midnight sky, incantations beneath the shadows fly.
Dr. WhiteFeather Hunter, thank you so much for joining me today. How are you doing?
I'm doing great. It is a balmy 29 degrees here in Ottawa, so I'm kind of locked inside in the AC, keeping cool.
There you go. Thank you so much for taking the time. I really appreciate it. We've been trying to get this together for the last few weeks. I wanted to talk to you specifically about your work. I was looking at your website, and you have different projects that you've done over the years. And you've managed to mix bioscience with occultism, witchcraft, and all of this, and just this interesting gumbo. And I wanted to get your take on, or why did you decide to present this work in this fashion?
Well, for me, the occult angle is through the lens of feminism, and so feminist witchcraft in particular, and to get even more niche than that, techno-feminist witchcraft. So I'm bringing together a few different fields. Techno-feminism is really interested in looking at the ways that women's role in technology and the politics of technology, how technology is used to either, oppress or advance, and who gets to benefit from that, in a nutshell. So, as we know, and as you've probably discussed on previous interviews, technology is not politically neutral. It's very politically loaded. So, with that understanding and going through the lens of feminism and techno-feminism, I'm incorporating witchcraft as a way to have a conversation about the way women's bodies are treated. And this is a really important conversation to have with the development of new biotechnologies, because again, what are the politics around those? Whose bodies are being used? Whose bodies are being instrumentalized to advance new technology, and who's benefiting from the advance of those new technologies? And, in particular, I'm interested in reproductive technologies, and biotechnology as a broad field is looking at ways to generate life outside of the built-in incubator that many women have in their bodies. So, a lot of the work that's done in a biolab is sort of stemming from that understanding of life that originates in a woman's body. So I'm really interested in all of the relationships there and all of the politics around that relationship between bodies and technology, and how it's influenced by gender, what the biopolitics are. And witchcraft is a really nice, provocative, figure and method to use in that sense to instigate sometimes some pretty heated dialogues.
Yeah, and I was looking at there's one that you have. It's called the Mom, cover your ears. The Pacification of Biotech. So when you're doing projects like that, do you call it things like that to get a rise out of someone, to get their attention?
Well, in this one case, Pacification, I'm using it subversively ultimately because it's a word that has been used by, I guess you could say, men's rights activists, talking about the pussification of American culture and, you know, how feminism has negatively impacted men's life and roles in society. So I'm riffing on that and I'm flipping it on its head. And I'm using this concept of pussification as a mode of empowerment to think about, you know, how can women appropriate technologies towards greater agency in the tech field? So that's sort of where that word comes from.
It's
And
definitely going to get some attention.
interestingly, I just discovered this recently. It's so funny. The book that the word comes from, and I believe it's called The Pacification of America or something like that, the original book, was published by an independent publisher called WhiteFeather Press.
Oh, wow.
Yeah,
All
so there's some weird, energetic overlaps in the universe right now.
right.
Yeah.
Now, let's see, because you had a part of that was called the sentient clit.
Yes.
And now we were just talking before we started that you actually grow all of these pieces in lab. So tell me a little bit about that. Like what was the process like, and what was the purpose?
So I have about 10 years of training in tissue engineering methods. And one tissue engineering method, and my PhD was revolving around using these methods from an artistic and a culturally critical perspective. So essentially, the biolab is my art studio, we could say. And the materials that I use are living cells, human cells, animal cells, mammalian cells, basically. Now, the cells that I have been working with for this project are stem cells that I have extracted and cultured from my own menstrual fluid. Because, and this is something that not a lot of people realize, menstrual fluid is not simply a waste product. It's very, very rich source of stem cells. And these are pluripotent stem cells. They can, differentiate, to use some technical language, biochemically transform into other cell types like heart cells, neurons, bone cells, fat cells, all of the cells that make up the human body. So I've been extracting and culturing these cells in the lab for the last 6 years. And one of the techniques that I'm really interested in bioengineering is 3D bioprinting. And this is being used, in regenerative medicine to print organoids, for example. Those are miniature versions of organs, specific human tissue cell types that can be used to test drugs on. So for drug delivery, efficacy, things like that. I've been interested in the capabilities of 3D bioprinting for creating living sculptural forms. So I got a very nice Canada Council for the Arts grant a few years ago to go and work in a lab in Montreal with a researcher who has a really fancy 3D bioprinter. So I was able to experiment printing some forms, and I started out printing menstrual cups, kind of being meta about my project, I guess, in that I'm printing the form that the cells are being collected in, and then putting the cells back into these forms. So those were some successful experiments. Learning how to create my own bioinks using gelatin and alginate, for example, and then putting the stem cells into those forms. Now, this idea of bioprinting a clitoris followed that work. I began having a conversation with another artist who is based at the University of Texas in Austin. Her name is Jiaobo Li. She was working also with menstrual fluid. Her earlier research was looking at the proteomics of menstrual fluid, and then she became also interested in the stem cells. So we started having a conversation, and the idea for bioprinting a clitoris came from the recent discovery that snakes have two clitorises. And this was sort of big news for a while because it was discovered by some female scientists. Previously, it was believed that snakes didn't have any clitoris and that the function of reproduction had nothing to do with pleasure whatsoever. But in fact, they have two clitorises. It's called hemiclitors. So it's, double the pleasure, double the fun for the snakes. And we thought, wow, wouldn't that be cool if we could also have two clitorises? And so with that idea, we developed the project to create prosthetic clitorises, but we took it a step further. And that is that we thought it would be really, really interesting to differentiate the stem cells into neuronal types, with the idea that perhaps the clitorises could even come to think, or maybe something along the lines of dreaming. And what would a wet dream in a petri dish look like? So part of the experiments that I've been doing in the past year have been to differentiate these stem cells into neuronal types. And I was able to develop a protocol that works well with this cell type. Because each stem cell type is different, needs different, growth factors to trigger the differentiation. So I experimented with that. I got some very nice neuronal cell type formations. And then we thought it would be really cool to also differentiate some of the stem cells into cardiomyocytes. And those are heart muscle cells. And for your listeners who might not realize this, every individual heart cell that is in your heart beats with its own heartbeat. So it's together, they form the muscle contraction that is your heartbeat. But every single cell has that heartbeat. So we thought, okay, we could co-culture neurons and heart cells together in a clitoris so it would potentially twitch and think about it. And so these are sort of the wild ideas that we are working on so far. I've got the protocol for the neuronal differentiation. Next step will be to look at differentiating the stem cells into cardiomyocytes and then print them together in that gelatin alginate form and let them grow and see what happens. So lots of exciting future steps for this project. It'll be in progress for a while.
So let's go back a little bit, because a lot of the people I've spoken to always have some type of origin story, like why they got into what they're into. So what led you to this type of research to begin with?
My background, my art background, is actually originally a craft background. And this links back to witchcraft as well. So I am trained in textiles. I taught textiles for about 10 years, and specifically weaving and spinning. So in my textile practice from the very beginning, and we're talking back as far as 1999, I was using human body materials and menstrual blood as fiber. I was making a lot of my work from human hair, spinning it into yarn, twisting it into rope, knitting it, weaving it, etc. Mm-hmm. And I was also using menstrual blood to dye and stain some of my textile objects. So I've always been working with body materials Okay.
Okay.
Around 2013, I saw a random call for participants who had never worked in a lab before. Specifically, they were looking for people who had no lab experience to come do a workshop in tissue engineering. And I applied for that workshop. I got a place, and it was a 3-day workshop. And I was introduced to cell culture from the perspective of looking at the creative possibilities for this. And my mind just exploded because I immediately started to make the association between, the tissues of the body and the tissues or, weavings that I was producing in the studio. And immediately I knew right then, right away, I want to grow cells on weavings. And that became my master's thesis work. So I developed protocols for 3D printing little miniature looms. I would weave hair, my own hair and horsehair, onto the looms. And then those woven grid structures were what I used as tissue engineering scaffolds, and discovered really interesting cell behavior on the weavings. They actually mimicked the structure of the weaving in the way that they formed tissue on them. So that was, really exciting. And that set me off on a whole new direction in my art practice. And I traded in my studio apron for a lab coat, and the rest is history. I've been working in the lab ever since.
So, one of your projects is called The Witch in the Lab Coat, like you were just describing the lab coat.
Yeah.
What is the significance of that project, and how are you challenging traditional scientific narratives when you're saying the witch in the lab coat? Most scientists would probably say witchcraft isn't real, so but it's like you're almost putting it together. Is
Yeah.
what's the reason for that?
So again, this is coming from a feminist perspective, and I'm looking at ways to question some of the aspects of science culture, bioscience culture in particular. And that is this question of objectivity that, is sort of the standard by which science operates. And there are legitimate reasons for reaching towards objectivity as a goal with experimentation. Part of that is to eliminate biases, trying to find, results that don't just reflect what you hope to see, but what is actually there. So, this idea of objectivity is not in and of itself a terrible idea. What concerns me with this idea of objectivity is a depersonalization process that you have to go through in learning scientific methodologies that can actually be harmful and can create knowledge gaps. It's kind of a swing too far to the other side. Now, witchcraft, magical thinking, the occult, these things are very subjective. That's sort of the opposite end of the spectrum. But again, there's a good reason for subjectivity. And that is not just to create the world you want to see. It's a deliberate process of making meaning in, making sense of the world, making something personally relevant to you. And that also is something that I see as having value in lab research, particularly when you're working with highly personal materials. For example, the materials that are coming from my body are deeply connected to my life story, my matrilineal history, my health history. I have sort of an embodied understanding of the materials that can't necessarily always be put into words or necessarily proven, but has served me well in the lab for understanding how to work with the materials that I'm working with. That's sort of just one aspect of this. So when I say I'm the witch in the lab coat and I'm bringing witchcraft into the lab, I'm talking about repersonalizing the materials that I'm working with, repersonalizing my relationship with cells, interjecting that concept of relationality to the living materials that I'm working with, reintroducing this idea of empathy even. And, sometimes when I've talked about this, whenever I'm giving a public talk and I broach this topic, I've actually had scientists come up to me after the talks crying. They're crying because they've had to divorce their subjective emotional selves from the work that they do. And that's, in a way, it's inhumane. And so they're breaking down because they're given permission in a way. I'm talking about the problem of being so depersonalized from the work that you're doing when you're working with living materials. So, that's one of the topics that I'm really interested in, using this idea of witchcraft as a meaning-making process is part of what I'm interjecting into my laboratory practice.
Wow, I love that. One of the projects that you're involved in was called the Homuncularium, which
The
is
Homuncularium.
right, which is
Yeah.
a homunculus is a term that everyone should look up. It's a very interesting concept. But tell me a little bit about this project. How did that get started, and what was it?
So the homuncularium is a word that I made up based on the word homunculus. And this comes out of research that I have been doing over the past few years at the Museum of Witchcraft and Magic in Boscastle in Cornwall. So I first went to the museum in 2022, I believe, and then I went back again this year as a follow-up research period. And I was really interested in finding information about the relationship between biotechnology, contemporary biotechnology, and folk magic.
Okay.
And I found a really direct trajectory that links to local folk magic in the form of mandrakes, belief in mandrakes, all the way through to the advancement of alchemy as a science. And the homunculus is something that comes out of alchemy. And the homunculus is early tissue engineering. It's early attempts at growing a miniature human in vitro. Now,
it's a very interesting concept. Yes.
That protocol involves culturing sperm in a blood nutrient. So, it's not that far off from what happens in a lab today. But it was also because alchemy also involves a spiritual aspect. It was directly linked to a spiritual solution, we'll say. The homunculus was cultured and grown, supposedly, in order to redirect cosmic malevolence away from the person to this miniature human proxy. Now, what's interesting for me is that biotechnology is trying to do the same thing. Now, I mentioned to you, bioprinting organoids in order to test for drug delivery. Right. Essentially, one of the things that biotechnology is trying to do now is to reproduce aspects of the human to test for diseases. The cosmic malevolence is now understood to be a biological disease. So there's a really interesting meandering line of development from folk magic and mandrakes, okay, because mandrakes were the first human proxy.
Now, mandrake, for the people who don't know, mandrake is a root that has physical proportions that look similar to a human. So it looks like it has legs, it looks like it has arms, and the sprout looks like a head. So that's why it's called a mandrake.
Exactly. And the connection goes further than that too, because like I mentioned, the homunculus was sperm cultured in vitro. A mandrake was believed to grow out of the ground when a man was hanged, and at the moment of his death, he gets an erection and ejaculates on the ground. And where the semen has fallen to the ground, a mandrake grows. Now, I also found, and this was in looking at, some of the rare books and the primary texts in the library at the Museum of Witchcraft and Magic, a female homunculus, a female mandrake. A female mandrake is formed when a woman is hung and menstruates on the ground. So these body fluids are understood to have magical life-giving properties from the time of early folk magic, belief in mandrakes, through to homunculus. Anyway, the homuncularium is a series of experiments that I've done and performances, ritual performances that I've done to follow those early protocols that were developed by Paracelsus, early alchemist, and see if I can grow a homunculus. Now, there is a homunculus in process right now growing in a secret place in Cornwall as part of my exhibition that's up at the Museum of Witchcraft and Magic right now. And that homunculus needs to incubate for 40 weeks. And it just so happens that I initiated this protocol through a ritual on the lunar eclipse in March. And 40 weeks from the day will be New Year's Eve, which is my birthday. So the homunculus will be born on my birthday.
Oh, wow. And this is the ritual that you have just on the website?
Yes.
It's like it's in the center of the room. It's wooden with a triangle.
So that was the second iteration of the homuncularium. So the first one I did in Cornwall with some sperm donors. The second one, I worked with a filmmaker from Toronto named Elizabeth Littlejohn, and she and I collaborated on this new iteration. We developed the ritual further and performed it in Crete. And we incorporated some of the local mythology by including red string, because not only is red string kind of referential of, menstruation like a tampon string, but it's also referencing Ariadne's thread. And Ariadne's thread, for people who aren't familiar with this, is a ball of string that was given to Perseus as he entered the labyrinth to find and kill the Minotaur. And so he unwound the string on his way in and then wound it back up to find his way out. So Ariadne's thread, that's the origin of the meaning, but now it has come to mean bioethical dilemma. So,
okay.
So that iteration that was done in Crete was specifically with Elizabeth Littlejohn, and she produced a video.
Yep.
Yeah, great.
I wanted to ask you about the tools you use. Do you use any form of artificial intelligence or anything in your work?
The only AI stuff that I have used is for some initial prototyping of ideas, to generate, some visuals as I'm working through what kind of visuals I want to develop for my rituals. So I use it as a visual generative tool just for prototyping ideas. And that's the extent of it at this point.
How long does something like a clitoris take to gestate in the lab? How long does something like that take?
Good question. So all cell types grow at different rates. And it also depends on what nutrients they're being fed.
Mm-hmm.
So, muscle cells, for example, do really well when they're fed horse blood. The standard is fetal calf serum. And this is another reason why I was looking at using menstrual blood in my lab, in my work, to substitute my blood for the animal blood that is standardized and typically used. So with the cell types, the neurons, the neuronal types, I won't say neurons because there are lots of different neuronal types. And I haven't done the antibody staining to determine exactly which types they are yet. They look like astrocytes, but just so your listeners know, there are many types of neuronal cells. The ones that I was differentiating and growing for my most recent residency in Lisbon took, I want to say, and again, it depended on what I fed them because I was trying different things to see how I could affect their growth and their shape. But I did manage to produce neuronal types and dendritic structures on my cells after only 48 hours. Now, to get them to a critical mass where they can be bioprinted, I'm going to predict would take approximately 2 weeks. So the cells would be printed at a very high concentration into the gel forms. And this is specific to neuronal types because neurons do not divide. So the neurons that are in the shape when it's printed are all of the neurons that are going to be there. And, understanding that eventually some may die off and you'll have a little bit less just because whatever the conditions are that they're being cultured in. So how long they would live and grow and thrive in that clitoris form remains to be seen because it hasn't actually been done yet. So that's also another exciting thing about it is to, determine these sorts of parameters that we don't know yet. Oh, I was going to say these specific stem cell types that come from menstrual fluid are now being used to cure Alzheimer's.
Okay, tell me a little bit more about that.
So right now, bone marrow stem cells are the gold standard in regenerative medicine. But like I said, all stem cell types are different. And what's recently been discovered about the menstrual stem cells is that they are the superior stem cell type for differentiating into certain other cell types like neurons and cardiomyocytes. So those are the two cell types that they're really, really good for. And that is just because it's more efficacious. They will differentiate more quickly than other stem cell types. So they are really useful. Okay. It's just that they're under-researched for obvious reasons. Just the taboo nature.
I'm looking at an article about that. So it says because it's so it's the stem cells that are in the menstrual fluid is what is being used to treat the Alzheimer's patients.
Yeah.
Interesting. What on your to the on your website two of the terms that I thought were interesting is biotechno-feminism, which we discussed earlier.
Yeah.
What is eco-techno-feminism?
So I don't just work in a laboratory. I also sometimes work in the landscape. And
Okay.
this is using the landscape as a laboratory, essentially, and shifting the focus of my work to understanding the ecology that I'm in and the interrelatedness of all of the agents within that ecology. So I could give you an example of a project that I did in 2018. I was working in a toxic legacy gold mine tailing site. So this is a site where all of the waste product from gold mining has been dumped. And it's full of mercury, it's full of arsenic, it's full of all of these toxic chemicals that nobody really knows how to deal with. So what I was interested in doing, and the work that I did in the lab, this was in Halifax, Nova Scotia. The work that I did in the lab was to culture a specific species of bacteria that is known to produce microparticles of 24 karat gold. And not only does it produce microparticles of gold, but it also metabolizes mercury and other heavy metals to produce this gold. So I thought it was a really poetic gesture, this relationship between a microbe and the soil, where it would bioremediate it essentially and give little bits of gold back. And for me, this was something that I really enjoyed as a poetic gesture, because it wouldn't happen within any capitalistic time frame. It would happen more within a geological time frame. It would take a long time to deposit enough gold to replace what had been taken from the land. But I was really interested in looking at these kinds of symbiotic relationships, the way microbes can come in and heal a space, an ecological space that had been damaged by human industry. So that's what I'm talking about with that term.
Okay, nice. And then, when you're creating these different experiments in the lab, what do you do with them after you're done? Is it you have like a warehouse of these things, or what do you do with it?
Funny that you should mention that, because I just a couple of weeks ago emptied a storage unit that has had all of my stuff sitting in it for the last 3 years. And a significant portion of the belongings in that storage unit are remnants of these art processes, these art science processes and biotech processes. However, I do also store things in -80 freezers in different labs around the world. So, for example, my menstrual stem cells are in cryopreservation in Portugal, in Canada, in Australia, in Germany, in Berlin. Where else? Anyway, all is to say, they are dispersed, and they're being used by other researchers as well. So they have a life beyond me and beyond my body, and I really like that. Other things that may present a potential biohazard are they end up being autoclaved and inactivated, so that there's no risk to anyone or the ecology.
Gotcha. And are there any, because when you're presenting your experiments and your art, I mean, the artist community may view it one way. What has been the view from the scientific community? Has there been any pushback? Any, what are you doing this for? Like, anything like that?
No, the opposite. I prefer scientists to artists. In fact, scientists are really creative thinkers, and they're incredibly curious, and they're a little bit less cynical than most artists. So I have been, for the most part, welcomed with open arms by scientists into their labs. I've been invited by scientists into their labs, and they see that I'm technically skilled in what I'm doing. I'm not just going in there and mucking around and not understanding the protocols. I am understanding the protocols, and I'm creating new protocols. So, the foundation of my knowledge is scientifically sound. What I have encountered, where I have encountered resistance, is in the administrative bodies. So university administrators have a really hard time wrapping their minds around this kinds of research. It's crossing disciplinary boundaries, and a lot of institutions are heavily invested in maintaining their disciplinary boundaries, I've discovered. So all is to say, I have scientists on my side, and if it wasn't for their support, I would never get past the bureaucratic roadblocks that I've encountered. They have really facilitated this work even being able to happen. So I'm super grateful to the scientists I've worked with. They have been wonderful people. In conversation sometimes with scientists who don't really know what I do and haven't seen my work and don't know my track record, they will be a little bit more skeptical. But I have found that is fairly quickly overcome after, we have a good conversation about it.
Awesome. And is there if your work could be used for one thing, what would you want it to be used for? Like we talked about Alzheimer's, regrowing body parts, or do you think it's just like wide open, like whatever you can use this for, go for it?
So this is where I diverge from scientists, because I'm not really interested in solutionism. I see solutionism as a tool of capitalism and there's nothing wrong with solving problems of human suffering. But what I see and what I've seen across the board is solutionism is used as a way to hype something that is in development in order to gain investor dollars. It's often marketed in a very moralized way. So this, anything that touches on weird morality for me as a witch immediately becomes a problem. A moralized approach to bodies can lead us down many dark paths, as we've seen in the past. So, I'm interested in investigating ideas of pleasure, erotic pleasure. That's what the Pacification project is about. Using biotechnology not just as a solution to solve infertility problems or other, reproduction, red market problems, but as a way to have more pleasure in the world. And that we could argue whether or not that's solving any problems. You could sort of speculate that perhaps it could be an implant for people who have suffered from genital mutilation, for example. It could be developed into something like that by scientists. I'm not necessarily interested in doing that project. I'm more interested in a project that's going to provoke critical dialogue, and that's the main goal behind all of the work that I do.
Gotcha. Well, Dr. Hunter, this has been an amazing conversation. Thank you so much for taking the time. I appreciate it.
Casting circles beneath the midnight sky. Incantations